Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We're going to give folks a couple more seconds to join us from the waiting room, and we will start today's webinar very shortly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar, Researching and Writing Historical Fiction with author Carol Baldwin. My name is Taylor Wolford, and I am the Reference Services Supervisor for North Carolina's Government Heritage Library. This webinar is hosted by the Library of North Carolina Government Heritage Library, and to learn more about the Library of North Carolina and the services that we offer, you can check out our website, which we will link in the chat in just a moment. First, I'd like to talk a little bit today about accessibility settings for our webinar. To enable live captioning, you can click your mouse and hover over the control toolbar on the top or bottom of the screen and click on the CC or live transcription button. Second, you can select either show subtitle or view full transcript. You can also change the subtitle settings, including the caption size, by clicking on the subtitle settings button, and that will direct you to adjusting the caption sizes for live captioning. To make any changes to the caption or accessibility settings, as I mentioned, you can click on the closed caption or CC button and click the subtitle settings. A new window pane will open, and in that left pane, you can click on accessibility and make any changes you would like. If you have any questions or are having any technical issues with today's webinar settings, please use the chat box to submit questions for our staff to assist you with or to request help. A quick note, today's webinar will be recorded and made available online via the Library of North Carolina's YouTube channel. I will be also facilitating a Q&A session after the presentation today. So as Carol is presenting, please feel free to put any questions for her in the chat, and we will address the questions in the Q&A portion of the webinar after the presentation concludes. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's lovely guest speaker, Carol Baldwin. So Carol is a writer, educator, and speaker who currently resides in Charlotte, North Carolina. She has written for local and national publications and presented at numerous writing and educational conferences. Carol published her debut YA historical novel, Half Truths, which was released last year in 2025. Half Truths is a historical fiction novel set in the 1950s in North Carolina that follows 15-year-old Kate Dinsmore as she navigates the complexities of race, friendship, and truth in segregated Southern society. For Half Truths, Carol has been awarded the 2025 YA North Carolina Book Award from the North Carolina Literary and Historic Association, a Historic Book Award from the North Carolina Society of Historians, and the Bronze Coming of Age Award from Reader's Favorite. And now I will hand it over to Carol to begin today's presentation. Thank you, Carol, for speaking with us today, and I will go ahead and stop sharing my slides. And Carol, I will bring up your slides to present.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to the North Carolina Library. Oh, the Library of North Carolina. I said it wrong. I had it written down. I said it wrong. But thank you very much for hosting me today. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about researching and writing historical fiction. So the QRC code on the right-hand side is if you want to take a picture of that, or the recording will be available through YouTube. You'll get it then, but that will it links to this PowerPoint, so you can see it also that way too. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me. And the first picture that we have, which hasn't come up yet, Taylor's gonna, there we go. There's a picture of me as a little kid on the sofa with a book. My parents were German immigrants. They were very interested in all of my siblings and I to learn about reading. So that's with my grandfather up at the left-hand corner, my parents, and then with a couple different slides of different pictures of my parents. But I grew up in South Jersey, and I moved to Charlotte about 40 years ago. And that's when I started thinking a little bit about my hometown and what Charlotte was like. Before Half Truths, I published two other books, and one is called Friendship Counseling. We're going to see a picture of that in a minute. And that is because I have my master's in counseling, and it's about lay counseling in the church. And the second nonfiction book I published is Teaching the Story, Fiction Writing in Grades 4 through 8. And before I published Half Truths, which we're going to see a picture of next, and me signing my first copy of Half Truths, which was for my neighbor, who is just thrilled. That was the day that I got my books in a book box. But before I published Half Truths, I published and wrote nonfiction because that was easier for me to describe what my neighbor's house looks like across the street, or a horse that is in a book that if I was writing a book about horses, to describe something in words was easy, but to come up with fiction seemed pretty scary to me. But about 45 years ago, a friend of mine gave me some Cynthia Voigt books, and I fell in love with the whole idea of a young adult book. And it became a goal of mine to write a young adult book. So we can look at the next slide again. Next, please. So this is a little bit about Half Truths. And if you click it, we'll see a picture. There you go. There's a picture of the cover and some of the awards that Taylor just mentioned. And a lot of people want to know why I wrote Half Truths. Why did I write a book that takes place in the South in 1950? Well, when I came here, I didn't know a thing about the South. I hadn't been south of Washington, D.C. I came here to marry my husband and become a stepmom. I was curious about what life was like here in Charlotte before civil rights. If any of you have been to Charlotte, or if some of you live here, you realize that Charlotte isn't very big on preserving historical sites. And so I was just curious about what life could have been like here. And I developed this idea of having an unlikely friendship between a white girl and a black girl. So that idea expanded and grew, and then I focused again as I had to write drafts and research. But mainly what spurred me on was my curiosity. In retrospect, my background in mental health and counseling and interesting in family dynamics also shaped the book, because it is a generational book. It's a book about Kate, who's the white girl, discovering some half-truths in her family that link her to the black girl, Lillian Dinsmore. So the book starts out in Tabor City and then moves to Myers Park and into the Cherry neighborhood in Charlotte. Tabor City is a small tobacco town on the way to Myrtle Beach. It took me a while to figure out that that's where the story was going to start. But when I found it, it just really fit with the story. So, like I said, it is an unlikely friendship between a white girl and a black girl, who actually not only do they have this unlikely friendship, but they discover along the way that they are related. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that as I tell you about my research. I think we're ready to go to the next slide. So the next slide is, I'm going to share with you some of the things I did right and some of the things that I did wrong. And I don't know if any of you are Fox Sports fanatics. My husband is, and so I hear Colin Cowherd almost every day talking about what a team did right or what a team player did wrong. And so that was in my head when I was creating this PowerPoint. So we're going to hear about what I did right and what I did wrong as a novelist. So let's go to the next slide about my research process and specifically what I did right. So the first thing I want to mention is my mentors, not a thing, it's a person. Joyce Moyer Hostetter writes historical fiction that takes place in Hickory, North Carolina, where she lives. She and I met probably about 25 years ago. We were presenting at a conference in Birmingham, Alabama, and we ended up hooking up together and doing a variety of conference presentations together and teaching together. But she also taught me a great deal about research. And one of the first things she said is my need to research locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And I wouldn't have thought about all those levels. I would have thought about, of course, I need to know what was going on in Charlotte at the time, or before 1950. I picked 1950 after bouncing around with a couple of different ideas, but I picked 1950, and of course I knew I needed to know what life was like, what people were wearing, what the people were working, where they were living conditions, how they talked, but I hadn't thought about regionally, nationally, or internationally. And because Joyce had this, helped me have this in my brain, then it helped me to expand the whole concept of half truths. And I knew that Kate was going to be a girl. I had in my mind that she was going to come into Myers Park, which is a very fancy part of Charlotte, and she was going to be living with her rich grandparents, but she was going to be coming from to a rural area somewhere outside of Charlotte. I didn't know what that area was going to be until I was researching different places in North Carolina and South Carolina, and I came across the story, a real story of a KKK parade that came through in Tabor City, North Carolina in 1950. So that's the region. That's not just Charlotte particular. That's what's happening in the region. So the KKK it was still active then. It wasn't as predominant as in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, but it was still active. So I needed to look regionally, I needed to look nationally if there were national things that were going on that influenced my story, and internationally. And so in 1950, that's the beginning of the Korean conflict, which plays just a little piece in the book, but is important for me to know as the author. So secondly, and we can go to the second thing that I did right, was I used the Charlotte Observer's archives. Now, some of you may recognize that machine that's sitting there on a desk in the Charlotte Library. It's the name of it is just gone out of my head, but I'm sure you're all seeing it, and you can put it into the chat because it's just out of my head. But that was before the age of the internet. And so I went downtown and I copied a lot of articles. I looked particularly at the Charlotte Observer newspaper and for whatever was going on in town. And what I found were articles about the Korean conflict. I found things about what what teens were wearing. What I found information on the society column. I found recipes. Everything that was in the Charlotte Observer at that time, and all that was news. What was interesting is that there were some very small articles about Negroes. There weren't very many, but there were a few interspersed in that. And I really wanted to also look at the Charlotte Post, which was Charlotte's Black newspaper, but unfortunately, those weren't saved or archived or put on microfilm machine. There you go. It's a microfilm machine or microfiche. Anyway, so unfortunately, I couldn't find the Charlotte Post articles, but you know what? Just the fact that the Charlotte Post articles and those newspapers weren't weren't digitized or weren't put onto microfilm tells you something about the period. So thirdly, what else? The other thing I did was write is I was curious. I was very open to ideas and ready to learn. And fourth, I learned from about 100 people who I call my experts. They were both blacks and whites who either lived through the time period or had parents who lived through the time period. And those were like gold to me. Hearing what these people's stories were and hearing their experiences helped me to understand what life was like in Charlotte in 1950 before civil rights. I also, the next thing is I kept notes on each person, which was really good. In fact, I was just looking at those notes yesterday for another presentation that I'm doing. And it's just, it brings back it brings back those people to me and what they said and how much they shared of their personal life. Next one is that I chronicle my journey on my blog, which was really helpful to build reader interest. I hope some of you are interested in writing historical fiction, and that's why you're in this webinar today. And so chronicling it in some way is a really good idea for yourself and for your potential readers. And it was a way for me to see the development of my ideas. By the way, it took me about 18 years to write this book. That was a lot because even though I felt confident as a writer, I had never written a novel before. So I had to learn a lot about writing a novel. You're going to hear about that in a minute. And um, I had a lot of material to gather, and I had to learn how to write. Like I said, I had to learn how to write a novel. So it took a long time. And lastly, the last note here is the thing that I did right is I created an online bibliography through mybib.com. So that was very helpful in keeping track of my sources. Don't wait until after you're done to start putting your bibliography together. Some publishers will want to see that bibliography along with your query about your work. They want to know your resources aren't just Wikipedia. And while you're working on that, annotate it so you know um, why that particular article is important or book. So the next slide is my research process and what I did wrong. So here again, this is thanks to what is his name? Mr. Cowherd. You're going to hear some of the things that I did wrong. Okay. So the first thing is I didn't create an organizational plan first. So I'm assuming that we have in the audience people who want to write historical fiction. And if you're desiring to do that, you're going to acquire a lot of information. It's really important to have set up where that information is going to go so that you can find it and you don't spend hours trying to find this story or that story. So I can't tell you what my system is because my system won't be your system, but you're going to create folders and then your subfolders and label them so that they're easily found. Make a system that works for you. I worked in Word and in Scrivener, and I've eventually moved over to Scrivener because I found that their software is very intuitive and it's really good for keeping notes and all these folders and subfolders. So the first thing is you need to create an organizational plan. The second thing is that I did wrong is I didn't take enough pictures. So in the beginning, when I was first meeting with people, and I remember this was like close to 20 years ago that I was beginning, and I don't think I had a cell phone there, but I did definitely had a camera. I could have taken pictures. I didn't take pictures of the first people that I interviewed, which I really regret now. And make sure when you take those pictures that you record the name, the date, the birth date of the person, perhaps, the place you interviewed, and any contact information in case you need to get back to that person. The third thing, I'm not sure if I did this wrong or not, so I put this as possible. Some people audio record each person that they interview, and I did that for a little bit, but then I found it was so tiresome and lengthy to transcribe that. So I stopped doing that. I kept the few that I have just because it's interesting to hear their voices. But there's now, I'm sure there's software now that will transcribe it for you. So that's something to think about. The other thing that I didn't do is maybe, possibly, I talked to too many people because every time I talked to somebody, I was so excited about the story that they told me that I wanted to include it in my book. So, it was very easy, as I'm going to mention again, for me to lose focus because I was like, oh, if there was, so somebody told me once about, she was a white man who told me about this Black teenager that he knew who got into trouble and he ended up being arrested and hanging himself in a prison. And I just, when he was telling me this story, I just thought, oh, I want to include that in Half Truths. And I went off onto all sorts of rabbit holes of finding out about prisons at the time and where were people monitored in the prisons and all sorts of things. And of course, that never ended up in Half Truths because it's not the story that I wanted to tell. So the moral of the story is talk to a lot of people as you can, as many as you can, but also keep in mind what your story is about. Another thing that I did wrong is that initially I tried too hard to get all the details right. So for example, if I was writing about a dress that Kate was wearing, like to her debutante luncheon, for example, because that's a big scene in the book where her grandmother gives her a luncheon. I would spend a lot of time describing that dress and I would go and look at pictures and then I would put them into Pinterest. I don't have Pinterest in here, but that's a really good resource for historical fiction writers is to create different boards so you do have images. Sorry, that's a rabbit trail. But anyway, I would spend too much time in the beginning trying to get all those details right, not even being sure that I'm going to need them later on. So now in my next book that I'm writing, if I'm not, I'm more likely to put something called a placeholder. So I'll just put XYZ. So I won't write in there exact color or material, for example, of that dress or the style of that dress. I can do that research later when I'm sure that that's going to go into my story. And finally, I should have used an online tool to create a fictional genealogy. And I just put those two links in here to Family Echo or World Anvil. You can also do ancestor.com, but I don't think that leans towards a fictional genealogy. I had genealogies because my story is about two girls who discover that they are related. So it's about their great grandparents. I wrote those out on pieces of paper, lots of pieces of paper, and I needed to do that. I needed to see it visibly, but it's a really good idea when in your research to create a genealogy if you're writing historical fiction. Okay, so our next slide is creating the historical narrative, what I did right. And the pictures here, or in the top picture, you're going to see a lot of books. And in the bottom picture, you're going to see a place that I went to. So hold on a second. I have to get back to where I was. So this is just a small sampling of the books that I consulted. Excuse me. I think there are about 6 or 7 pictured here. And I can't say that I read all of them from front to back, but several of them I reread over and over again because um, they were so on target to what I was trying to do in Half Truths. So you want to read a lot about the period that you are writing about so that I don't even feel like I'm an expert, but I probably know more than the average bear because I have read these books, and those books will inform your story. The other thing that I did right is I went to places. So that is a picture on the bottom of the screen of the community center. It's called Billingsville School, but it's actually now the community center in Greer Heights. It was a Rosenwald school built in the 20s by a man named Julius Rosenwald, who is a Chicago philanthropist. He partnered with Booker T. Washington to he was very concerned about the education, the poor education for Black students. And so he partnered with him in creating these schools. The Black community would have to put up some money or some land to put the school together. Anyway, I went to this one in Greer Heights. It's now a community center. And I met with two Black gentlemen who had gone to school there. They told me some stories about going to school there. But the two things, well, first of all, I want to tell you that this was just a part of my going on part of the African American tour of Charlotte. So, but this was the most significant one part of that tour that impacted half truths. When I went there, I saw that on the walls they had the pictures or the portraits of the principals, former principals in the school. And I looked at one of the men's picture and I thought, oh, he is white. They had a white principal there. And then I realized that he wasn't white. He was just very light-skinned African American. And that was at the point where I started thinking about Kate and Lillian being not just being friends, but that they end up realizing that they're related. At the moment that I realized that, which I don't know if it was exactly when I was there or soon afterwards, I realized that that would deepen the conflict between the girls, but I didn't realize how much that would really impact the whole story. Just the fact that these two girls are related. So Kate Dinsmore lives in Myers Park. Lillian Bridges lives in the Cherry neighborhood. I mentioned that earlier, that the book takes place there. So the Cherry neighborhood is just a mile or two away from Myers Park. It was developed after Myers Park was developed, and it was developed as a neighborhood for the Black middle class people. So you can look online. You can find out a lot about the Cherry neighborhood. And that's another place I went to, by the way. But anyway, so going back to this community center, so that was just such a key point in Half True Stories. And it was a difficult point for me to write authentically from from Kate's point of view, and also bringing in Lillian's voice as the together realize that they're related. And they're related through their great grandfather. They share a great grandfather. This is a young adult book, and so that implies a sexual relationship, but none of that is seen on the scene. It isn't seen in the story. It's all backstory that's implied, and just wanted to tell you that too. So that was one thing that I got from going there. The other thing is one of the Black gentlemen told a story about when he was a kid, his grandmother had come from South Carolina back to Charlotte. She wanted to visit her grandmother's grave. And when she went to where she thought her grandmother was buried, she saw that they were unearthing the grave to build a house there. So the grave was no longer there. And what they found instead is they found some object that she had been buried with. I don't remember now because I didn't have a camera. I didn't, well, and I didn't take a picture of the man talking to me, and I didn't describe it well enough, but I thought that that was a very interesting thing, that there was something buried in her grave that was important to her. And that becomes an important plot point in Half Truths, that it becomes a piece of china that both girls see in their household. Kate sees it in her grandmother's home, and Lillian sees it in her great-grandmother's grave when it's exhumed. And so that whole scene about Lillian's great-grandmother's grave having to be exhumed came out of my going to this community center. So going to places is really important. Excuse me. And sifting through them, and finding finding plot points that fit the story. Another place that I went to is I went to Tabor City. My husband and I were visiting in Myrtle Beach, and I just thought I'd go over to Tabor City, see what I could find. And I went to the library and met a woman who helped me dig out some articles about that KKK parade through Tabor City in 1950. And the that's that's an very the book starts out with that, with Kate observing that, And right away, the reader reads Mr. Horace Carter, who was the man who was the editor who documented that parade going through town. And it was as a result of his journalism that he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 because of his journalism in exposing the KKK. Well, anyway, that day that I went to visit Tabor City, I went to a senior center. The librarian suggested that I might be able to meet somebody who was still living, and who had lived during that time. And remember, so I was probably did this about 15 years ago. I went to the senior center and I asked if anybody lived through that, if they had seen the KKK come through town. And two women were very upset that I was asking that question. Two white women were very upset, and they mumbled something like, the KKK, um, you don't know how good they were to us, or something along the lines. They were alluding to the fact that the KKK had helped them in some way, and then they left. So I never heard their stories about that. I never heard why they said that. It's obviously a very shocking thing to hear, but they had a different point of view on the KKK. And that point of view is represented in Kate's grandpapa, her grandfather who lives in Tabor City, in his thinking. It got represented by these two, because of what these two women said and their different point of view on the KKK. I assume that perhaps their dads had been in the KKK, perhaps they had received some charity from the KKK, I don't know. But going to that senior center was also pivotal for me. So our next slide is what in the historical narrative, what I did wrong. So first point, in the very beginning, I hadn't narrowed down what time period I was in. I didn't know if I was talking about the 50s or the 60s, which is very embarrassing now to admit, but it's true. I had to do a lot of reading and understanding of the time period before I could write about it, and I wasn't even sure what it was, so I had some narrowing down to do. Secondly, as I've mentioned, I tried to fit in too many stories, and as a result, thirdly, I lost focus. Um, so, just different things I would hear from these experts. So one of the men I talked to told me about going to the Charlotte Armory and hearing music concerts, and the concerts were of Black musicians, and he was white, and all the white kids were on the top and all the Black kids were dancing on the bottom, which is a reverse type of segregation. And I thought that was a really interesting thought that was going on in the 50s. And I wrote scenes about that, but they all got cut out because none of them were about the very essence of what I told you in the very beginning, is an unlikely relationship between a white girl and a Black girl. And that was the relationship between Kate and Lillian, and discovering the half-truths is the core of the story. And when I listened to all those stories, sometimes I lost focus. So, okay, so writing a novel. Okay, what I did right in the next slide. So the first one is realized when I heard something that fit my story and I grabbed onto it, like that KKK parade through Tabor City in 1950. Although I have to admit to you, I read about it twice before it hit me. I read it once and it was just like, oh, it just didn't really resonate. And then the second time I was like, oh, this is how my book will begin. Secondly, I consulted several excellent craft books. There are some pictures on the slide of some of the books I use, but there's tons that are out there. Third, I subscribe to writing blogs and One Stop for Writers. I can't advocate enough for that website. It's about $100 a year. So it's not the cheapest thing, but it is full of information on how to write a book, on character and plot and dialogue, and and also very much about emotional wounds. So I would encourage you, if you're thinking about writing any kind of novel, to check out that website. The next one is that I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators and joined a critique group. That is incredibly important if you want to write any kind of book. I went to writing conferences. Next point, networked with other writers. Next point is I learned aspects of the business side of writing and I kept track of my submissions. And then finally, I revised, persevered, and hired a developmental editor, which was really important. Beyond getting critiques from critique partners, I needed to hire somebody who helped me to see what was wrong in the manuscript before I started submitting it. So some of the things that I did wrong. So yeah, hopefully you're learning from my mistakes. I tried to get the first chapter first perfect. I worked on that first chapter way too long, and the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book probably took me months to write. But my solution to that is I should have gushed it out and moved on, because the first chapter is inevitably, as mine did, changed. It changed so much. Secondly, the second thing I did wrong was I tried to nail down every detail while drafting. I mentioned that to you. So use placeholders instead. Third, I was easily distracted with extra characters and rabbit holes. Solutions is to focus on what the story is primarily about. Stick to your one-sentence summary or your pitch and remove from your manuscript or your ideas what moves the story forward or doesn't. And sometimes you're like, I really needed really good beta readers to show me how I had departed from my initial idea. So those are some writing and researching tips that I hope that will be helpful to you. Here are some places that Half Truths is available. The first link is a special edition ebook from Monarch Press, who is my publisher. The second is ebook and curriculum guide. You can, of course, find it on Amazon and then some local bookstores. And the third or the final guide is a link to the educator's guide. And then I hope that some of you will decide to follow me. That the last slide will show where you can follow me, but also I have a newsletter and a weekly blog. And now it's time for questions. And I talked a little bit fast, so we have extra time for questions, and that's how you can contact me too. So, do we have any questions in the chat?
Thank you, Carol, for such a wonderful and informative presentation. I'm now going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Carol, please put them in the chat now, and I will moderate the Q&A portion of today's webinar. We did get a question in the chat, Carol, a logistical question while you were presenting. So everyone who might have joined a little bit later today, we will be we are recording this webinar and we will make it available to everybody who registered after the event concludes through the Library of North Carolina's YouTube channel. So rest assured, if you'd like to refer again to anything that was covered today, you'll be able to review the recording. And then Carol has graciously shared the slides from today's presentation as well. Let me go ahead and navigate to the Q&A. So we did get one of the first questions that came in for you, Carol. How does it feel to write about the places that you can now visit? Is it surreal? And did you imagine that the characters were there amongst the places even after publishing the book?
Oh, wait a minute. Do one at a time. Those are two
Sure.
questions. Want to do the first one first.
How does it feel to write about the places that you can now visit? Did that feel surreal to you in any way?
It is really cool. You know, it is really cool. There's a scene at the end of the book where the girls are walking around Freedom Park. Freedom Park is still a part of Charlotte, North Carolina, and it is fun to go there and sort of imagining them being there. Part of my research was that I rode my bike around Myers Park trying to find the house that would be the house that Kate would live in. And now when I have visitors from out of town, I drive them by that house and they're like, oh, that's Kate's house, which it's not, but I just sort of modeled it after because I'm a pretty concrete person and I needed to visualize it. So I know that Kate didn't really live there, but it added something for sure that I could visualize it. Yes. And
Yeah,
what was
it's
the second part of that?
The second part was, did you ever imagine the characters were there amongst those places even after you published the book?
Sort of. I
Hmm.
guess it's sort of, you know, I mean, there's a lot of imagining that goes into any writing of fiction. I, for example, can't imagine writing fantasy, which is just like total imagination. I need to have some real things in there. So, someone who probably has more imagination would probably even um, imagine that more of them walking around or, when they have their conversations. But I did try to picture it in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating part about writing historical fiction of a place that you live in and around is you kind of get to immerse yourself in what it might have been like for those characters living through a specific time period, but also in the place that you are also existing. So I think that's a really fascinating part of historical fiction. Another question for you, Carol. Are you concerned about the rise of AI authors or artificial intelligence based generated scripts and texts, and how could they create works of historical fiction that are inaccurate but believable?
Of course, I'm concerned about that. Every author is. I mean, and every publisher, I know Monarch won't take a look at anything. I mean, a reputable publisher is not going to um, entertain anything that's AI um, created. So, of course, and I haven't, and I won't ever feed into any. I don't even know that much about AI particularly. I use it a little bit for Grammarly and checking the way sentence structure is and stuff like that. But, to plug in different things into AI and to see what it creates, that is just an anathema. It's just awful. It's really awful.
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit more to my own experiences using like playing around with AI tools for writing based on historical prompts or narratives. We do in the library here, the Government Heritage Library, manage NCpedia, which is an online resource of North Carolina history, culture, people, places, and events. And so I was working with our NCpedia librarian to write a submission to NCpedia, which is not historical fiction. These are all like primary source, well researched, documented events. But I took it upon myself to write an NCpedia article about a court case that happened in Eastern NC in the 1920s. And then because I was curious, I put that writing prompt into an AI tool. We use Copilot here in state government and asked it to write the same story about this person and the court case that they went through in the 1920s. Copilot or the AI tool said that this person did not exist and that this court case never happened. And I have so many primary source materials from my article that I wrote that proves that that is not the case.
Interesting.
Um, so my concerns, or I think others' concerns about using AI tools to do historical research is there is a possibility of erasure, like completely denying that entire events existed because AI does not have, or at least the tools was using at the time, does not have the capacity to research primary source materials and in your case, Carol, interview people who lived through those experiences and get that direct sort of interaction. So
Mhm.
I caution people to use AI with historical
Oh,
research
yeah.
with a
Oh,
very critical lens.
but I want to say, I didn't say this in my presentation, but Encypedia is great. I used it a lot when I was researching. Kate grows up on a tobacco farm, so that's tobacco's big in Tabor City, and that's where I learned a lot about tobacco farming. So because I have little bits of details about what that was like for her. I needed to know it as the author. Whatever I'm writing about, I need to know, and Encypedia was really helpful. So
Glad to
kudos
hear
to
it.
you.
So now that you've done all this research into the 1950s in North Carolina, do you think you'll use this research in future projects, or are you going to do a completely different time and place?
and I'm doing a completely different time and place for my next book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, but it's so funny though. I continue to collect material and books and still love talking to people. I met a person the other day, a Black woman who was in her 90s, and I was like, I should have interviewed you. You know, she would have been perfect because she went to the school, the Black school that my character goes to, but I didn't know her, but I still am interested in it.
Hmm.
But
Yep. How important do you think it is to have a writing mentor? I know you mentioned a mentor of yours. How important is that to have for a writer?
you're blessed if you have one. I think it is absolutely wonderful. I wouldn't say you have to go seek one. I didn't even seek out Joyce. I started calling her my mentor, and I think she was a little flabbergasted that I called her that. But that's really what she was because she read so many drafts of half-truths and, would tell me which way to go and what I was leaving out or what I needed to do more. So I say it's important if you can, but don't stress about it if you don't.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, we do have another question from the audience. How do you deal with concerns about cultural appropriation in your work?
I assume that the person asking that question is questioning me writing this as a white person about a Black character. I'm assuming that that's what the
Yeah,
question is,
that's
and
what I
that's a
did.
very legitimate question. It's one I was concerned about. And in fact, some backstory on why it took me 18 years is that first I wrote it from Kate's point of view. I took the manuscript to an SCBWI conference, and the editor suggested that I write it from both Kate and Lillian's point of view. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm not Black. And one of the people who became a developmental editor was like, yeah, go ahead and try it. Now, this was probably 15 years ago. So I spent 2 years doing flip-flopping chapters from Kate's and Lily's point of view. And so then I really delved way more into Lillian's point of view. By the time I finished that, I asked a friend of mine who's an agent, I said, can I send this to you? And I told her about it. And she said, no publisher is going to take it from you because you're white. You can't write this story from a Black point of view. So that was like I was about 8 or 9 years into the project by then. And it took me, that was a pretty hard blow, but I saw the wisdom in that. And I took some time off, but I drew back from it and started again. And um, so the best I can say is that I tried to be as authentic as possible. And that was one of the Black men that I interviewed who has passed away, but who he lived in Cherry and drove me around Cherry. And every time I talked to him about his stories, he would always say to me, Carol, just make it authentic. And what I'm experiencing right now is that Blacks individuals are picking the book up and are appreciating the research that I did and that I took it really seriously. But it is definitely a concern.
Hmm. Yeah. 18 years is an incredible amount of time to dedicate to your craft, Carol. I have to say that.
It
I
is.
can, I can only imagine the breadth and scope of your research. I'd actually love to see your research notes myself, see what kind of
I
um
still have them if you want them. I can't get rid of them.
see what type of interesting sources and insights you were able to gather over that period of time. What another question for you, Carol? What has been your greatest joy with being an award-winning published author?
Oh, answered prayer. I mean, there were a lot of times that people in my life would say, why are you doing this? And, just give it up, find something different. Why don't you just self-publish it? And things that just didn't resonate with me. And I'm not saying that all self-published books are bad, but, that's not what I wanted to do. But the fact that, and I prayed a lot that the Lord would open the right doors to a publisher. And I mean, one of the most exciting things was when a friend of mine told me about Monarch Publishing, which is a clean reads publisher, small North Carolina publisher. And I sent a query on a Saturday, and editor, or the publisher, I'm sorry, Jen Lowry, the publisher, read it, and she wrote back that day and said, "This is a stellar query. Send me the first 10 pages." Like on a Saturday. Like I was just, that was unbelievable.
Mhm.
So I think, I mean, the awards are a great, I mean, they are wonderful in terms of recognition of that work and acknowledgement. And I hope that they will be keys to helping the book get to into the lives of teens. That'll help me as a door to get through doors. Because it's hard to get the book into the hands of teens. I have more adult readers now than teens. But that day that she wanted to read the whole book was, and that was enormous.
Mhm. Thank you, Carol. Another question. I was actually curious about this too, so thank you to the person who posed this in the chat. How did you find and connect with your experts and the people that you interviewed? Because you interviewed a lot. You said 100 plus people. So how did you find these people and connect with them to facilitate that sort of research?
That's a good question. It was usually one person telling me about another person, kind of a thing. I actually the first group of people that I talked to, and I do not have a picture of them. I don't even think I have names. Was my husband is a dentist, and his dental office was very near to where the story takes place. And so he suggested to me that I interview one of his patients. And so she gathered some women together, and I was talking to them, and I was so naive and brand new to all this. And I asked questions about what it felt like to them to have Black servants. And one woman said to me, she said, "Why don't you go back to New Jersey and write something about New Jersey?" She was obviously offended that I was doing that. But anyway, I think that group of people from there, I learned about other people. And I would follow up if I read an article in the newspaper, I would follow up with some of those. One of the women I met, her name is Sally Robinson. She was very active. She is a very active philanthropist in Charlotte. She is like 92 now. And she told me, besides her telling me about the debutante life in Charlotte, because that's part of what happens for Kate, is her grandmother wants to make her a debutante, is she introduced me to a woman named Teresa Elder. And Teresa was the first Black woman who was a public health nurse in Charlotte. And so she just gave me lots of stories. I went to Second Ward High School, to their alumni house, and I met people there. So I just put myself in places where I can meet people. Good
Mhm.
question, though.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've got another question about AI. How do you feel about writers using AI just to create pictures or illustrations for children's books, but also acknowledging its use in the books?
I would discourage it. I would totally discourage it. I mean, unless you're an illustrator and you plan to self-publish it, I don't think any publisher is going to want to publish that. And yes, hire real artists. Real
Hmm.
artists are much better than AI, and for a reason. Yeah,
Hmm.
I would
Yeah,
discourage.
thanks, Carol. If anybody else has any questions for Carol, please put them in the chat. Carol, I did have a question for you. You talked a little bit about your sources for your research. So we know you did the interviews, which seemed incredibly informative. And you talked about the microfiche and the microfilm. Were there any other archival or library special collections materials that you
Oh,
accessed for your research?
um, at, yes, along the line, if I had a question, I would end up in some library.
Hmm.
So I actually started though at UNC, Charlotte, in their library, looking at and they're not called topographical, but they're maps of the area at the time. That was one of the first things that I did, is just look at a map of the city. And so I went there. I and I've accessed um, Kelly Alexander's papers, because Kelly Alexander was very much a part of the NAACP in Charlotte, and he has a minor role in the book. Um, And so I could access his papers through that library. So that's a good question. But oh, see, now you're asking me these questions. I want to tell you all these stories about these people. So um, I I didn't say directly that one of the things that was important to me was to pin some important people who were in Charlotte or in the area or things that were happening at the time to include them in my narrative. So Horace Carter, for example, who, okay, now I can show you this. This is the book he wrote. Can you see that? It's called The
Mhm,
Virus of Fear, and it's all about that KKK um, parade and the KKK coming into the county at the time. So he becomes a character in my book, just like Kelly Alexander. And also, there is a very slight mention of Reverend Delaney, who was in South Carolina, and he was um, lobbying for integration of schools. So there's a very slight reference to him, but he was pretty important. And he was one of the people that was in the background. And in fact, his case got went into the board, Brown versus Board of Education, um, you know, whatever that's called now. I can't, the decision. But
mhm,
okay, I say that to you because I was in the South Carolina archives to
mhm,
learn about Delaney. Okay. So I don't necessarily go directly to them. It's more like when I try to research and then I end up in those collections. But they had
yeah,
really cool stuff, both of those collections.
mhm. Wonderful. Yeah, it seems like a really great combination of like in-person interviews, archival and library research, historical newspapers. You kind of covered all the bases when it comes to good genealogical and historical research.
The newspapers. Do we have time to talk about the newspapers? Do you have any
Yes,
other
we
questions?
do. I love historical newspapers, so go ahead and share your experiences with
So
us.
the reason every chapter has a newspaper headline, and that's because a good friend of mine wrote a middle grade fiction based on her mother's life in Hiroshima. And she used Japanese, well, she translated them to English, newspaper headlines from from World War II. And I just thought that was so cool, and that I wanted to do that too. But it was really hard. That was one of the hardest things to do, was find those newspaper chapter headlines, because some of them didn't exist. And I did make up a few, but
Hmm.
also I really wanted more Black newspaper headlines. It was very hard to find them. Some of those were through the Library of Congress too.
Hmm.
So, but the newspaper headlines, I wanted it to be authentic as possible.
Yeah, I love that. That's a really great tie-in with like the historical research that you did, and making those your chapters. I think that's really nice tie-in as well. So we're just about at time. I want to thank you again, Carol, for such a wonderfully informative presentation. You gave us some really great research tips, some do's and don'ts, like you said. And also some great information for those of us who are interested in doing basic genealogy or historical research. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us today. And to all of our viewers, your feedback is very important to us. So we do ask that you take a few moments today and complete our survey that we've just popped in the chat there. We want to hear what you have to say and use that feedback to inform future outreach and education programming at the library. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will follow up with some links and resources for you all. Until then, we will see you next time, and thank you again, Carol.
You're welcome. It was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.